What happens when a single photograph can shatter the foundation of everything you believed about your family? For Jenny Coleman, a 26-year-old bartender drowning in her father's funeral expenses, that photograph was tucked inside an old cookbook she'd inherited. For Vincent Thornfield, a ruthless real estate mogul worth $3 billion, it was the image that would crack open his carefully constructed world. She was just trying to clean out her late father's apartment. He was just another wealthy patron ordering his usual whiskey. But when she saw the vintage locket hanging from his watch chain, a memory sparked that would ignite a firestorm of secrets, lies, and a truth so explosive it would topple one of Chicago's most powerful dynasties. This isn't a story about coincidence. This is the story of how a faded photograph in a dead man's kitchen would expose a century of betrayal and prove that some debts can never be paid, only inherited. The mahogany paneling of the Windsor Club absorbed sound like a confession booth, which was fitting since most of the conversations within its walls involved admissions that could topple governments or bankrupt nations. Jenny Coleman had been working behind the carved oak bar for 3 months, long enough to recognize the regulars by their drink orders and their particular brand of arrogance. At 11:30 on a Thursday evening, the club was in its twilight hour. The old money crowd had retreated to their penthouses, leaving behind only the night owls and the insomniacs who used expensive liquor as a substitute for sleep. Jenny was polishing glasses with mechanical precision, her mind elsewhere, calculating how many double shifts she'd need to cover her father's remaining burial costs. The heavy doors opened with their familiar creak, and Vincent Thornfield entered like he owned the building, which Jenny had learned from the other staff he actually did. At 42, he moved through the world with the casual confidence of a man who had never heard the word no applied to himself. His charcoal suit was perfectly tailored, his silver hair swept back with mathematical precision, and his pale grey eyes held the cold assessment of a predator evaluating prey. He took his usual seat at the far end of the bar, away from the scattered remaining patrons. Jenny approached with a crystal tumbler already in hand. "The usual, Mr. Thornfield. Macallan 25 neat?" He nodded without looking up from his phone, his fingers moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. As Jenny poured the amber liquid, she noticed something that made her breath catch in her throat. Hanging from his platinum watch chain was a delicate silver locket, no bigger than a silver dollar. The surface was etched with an intricate design of intertwining roses, and set in the center was a small emerald that caught the bar's warm light. Jenny's hand trembled slightly as she set down the glass. She knew that locket. She had held one exactly like it just days before, found tucked between the pages of her father's recipe collection. The memory hit her like a physical blow, her father weak and dying, pressing the tarnished locket into her palm with shaking fingers. "Keep this safe, Jenny," he had whispered. "It's all the proof we have left." "Proof of what?" she had asked. But he was already slipping away, the cancer finally claiming the last of his strength. "Excuse me, Mr. Thornfield," Jenny heard herself say, her voice barely above a whisper. "That locket, where did you get it?" Vincent's fingers stopped moving across his phone. He looked up, his grey eyes focusing on her with laser intensity. For a moment, the only sound was the quiet hum of the club's ventilation system. "I beg your pardon." His voice was cultured, precise, with the kind of accent that spoke of Ivy League educations and country club memberships. Jenny's heart hammered against her ribs. She should have kept quiet, should have minded her own business. But the image of her father's desperate eyes wouldn't leave her alone. "The locket on your watch chain. It's beautiful. It's just... My father had one exactly like it. I was wondering if they came from the same jeweler." Vincent's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, a tightening around his eyes that suggested her innocent question had hit something vital. He slowly detached the locket from his watch chain, holding it up to the light. "This belonged to my grandmother, Helen Thornfield," he said, his voice carrying a warning edge. "It's been in my family for over 70 years. There is no other like it." The certainty in his statement felt like a slap. Jenny knew what she had seen, what she had held in her own hands. "I understand, sir. It's just that my father's was identical, even down to the emerald and the rose pattern." Vincent set the locket down on the bar with deliberate care. "Your father's name?" "Coleman. Richard Coleman." Something flickered across Vincent's face. Not recognition, but something darker. "And what did your father do for a living, miss?" "Coleman. Jenny Coleman. He was a carpenter. He worked construction most of his life." She paused, then added quietly, "He just passed away last week." "I see." Vincent picked up his whiskey and took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving her face. "You said his locket was identical to mine?" Jenny nodded, wishing she could take back the entire conversation. There was something in Vincent's demeanor that had shifted from dismissive to dangerous. "That's impossible," he stated flatly. "This locket was commissioned specifically for my grandmother by Cartier in 1952. The design was unique, created to commemorate her marriage to my grandfather. There are no copies." The words hung between them like an accusation. Jenny felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm not lying, Mr. Thornfield. I saw it with my own eyes." Vincent stood abruptly, dropping a $100 bill on the bar. "Bring it to me." "What?" "Your father's locket. Bring it to me tomorrow evening. If it truly is identical to mine, then we have a problem that needs to be resolved." His smile was cold as winter steel. "Because if your father had a replica of a Thornfield family heirloom, then he was either a very skilled thief or someone has been telling lies for a very long time." He walked away without another word, leaving Jenny alone with the weight of his challenge and the terrible certainty that she had just opened a door she would never be able to close. The next morning, Jenny stood in her father's empty apartment, surrounded by boxes of his belongings. The place still smelled like his aftershave and the cigarettes he'd never quite managed to quit. She found the locket where she'd left it, wrapped in tissue paper inside an old cigar box. As she held it up to the morning light streaming through the kitchen window, she could see that it was indeed identical to Vincent Thornfield's. Every detail matched perfectly. The intricate rose pattern, the small emerald, even the delicate chain. But unlike Vincent's pristine piece, this one bore the patina of age and wear, as if it had been handled, cherished, worried over for decades. Inside the same cigar box, she found something else. A faded photograph she had missed in her initial grief-stricken search through his things. It showed a young woman with dark hair and kind eyes standing next to a tall man in a military uniform. The woman was wearing the locket. Jenny turned the photograph over. In her father's careful handwriting were the words, "Rose and Paul, 1952, she never forgot." Rose, not Helen, as Vincent had claimed. And the date, 1952, the same year Vincent said his grandmother's locket had been commissioned. Jenny's hands shook as she stared at the photograph. If her father's story was true, then Vincent Thornfield's family history was built on a lie. But if Vincent was right, then her father had somehow come into possession of stolen goods. Either way, she was about to walk into a confrontation that would change everything. That evening, Jenny arrived at the Windsor Club, carrying the cigar box like it contained explosives. Vincent was waiting for her in a private dining room on the club's second floor, a space that spoke of old money and older secrets. Oil paintings of stern-faced men in military uniforms lined the walls, and a fire crackled in the marble fireplace. Vincent gestured to the chair across from him without preamble. "Show me." Jenny placed the cigar box on the polished table and opened it. Vincent's face went completely still as he stared at the locket. Without asking permission, he reached across and picked it up, turning it over in his hands. "This is impossible," he murmured, but his voice lacked the conviction of the night before. "I found this too." Jenny placed the photograph on the table. Vincent's reaction was immediate and visceral. The color drained from his face, and his hands clenched into fists. "Where did you get this?" "It was in my father's things." "That's Rose, isn't it? Not Helen." Vincent was silent for a long moment, staring at the photograph with an expression Jenny couldn't read. Finally, he looked up at her, and she was shocked to see something that looked almost like fear in his eyes. "Your father," he said slowly. "Did he ever mention working for my family?" "No, he worked construction, mostly residential. He never mentioned the Thornfields, but he had this photograph. He had the locket." Vincent's voice was strained. "That means he knew her. He knew Rose." "Who was Rose?" Vincent stood and walked to the fireplace, staring into the flames. "Rose Manning was my grandfather's first wife. She died in 1953, less than a year after they were married. My grandmother Helen was his second wife, whom he married in 1955. The pieces began to fall into place with sickening clarity. "So the locket belonged to Rose, not Helen?" "Yes." Vincent's voice was barely above a whisper. "My grandfather told everyone that Helen's locket was a new commission, a symbol of their love. But if Rose's locket still exists, then he gave Helen the same locket he'd given to his first wife," Jenny finished. "He recycled it." Vincent turned from the fireplace, his face haggard. "Worse than that. If your father had Rose's locket, then he knew her. And if he knew her," he trailed off, unable or unwilling to complete the thought. "What happened to Rose?" Jenny asked quietly. "She died in a car accident. At least, that's what my grandfather always claimed. She was driving alone late at night. The car went off a bridge." Vincent's voice was flat, emotionless. "My grandfather inherited everything: her family's construction company, her real estate holdings, her trust fund. It was the foundation of the Thornfield fortune." Jenny felt sick. "You think it wasn't an accident? I think your father knew something that got Rose killed, and I think my grandfather made sure he could never tell anyone about it." The weight of Vincent's implication settled over the room like a shroud. Jenny thought about her father's last words. "It's all the proof we have left." Proof of what? Of murder, of a cover-up that had lasted 70 years. "There's something else," Vincent said, pulling out his phone. "I made some calls today. Had my people look into your father's background." He showed her the screen, which displayed a grainy newspaper clipping from 1953. The headline read, "Local carpenter questioned in Manning accident." Below it was a photograph of a young man who looked unmistakably like Jenny's father. The caption identified him as Richard Coleman, aged 24, who was working on renovations to the Manning residence at the time of the accident. Jenny's world tilted. "He was there. He was working at Rose's house. The article says he was questioned but never charged." "The investigation was closed after 3 days. Vincent's eyes were hard. 3 days for a suspicious death involving millions of dollars in inheritance. Someone made it go away. Someone with enough money and influence to buy silence. Vincent met her gaze. "Someone like my grandfather." They stared at each other across the table, two strangers bound together by a secret that had been buried for 7 decades. Jenny realized that her father had carried this burden his entire life, had died with the weight of it still on his shoulders. "What do we do now?" she asked. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and picked up the photograph of Rose and the young man in uniform. "We find out what really happened to Rose Manning," he said, "and we make sure that everyone who helped cover it up finally pays for what they did." But as Jenny looked into Vincent's grey eyes, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was making a deal with the devil himself. Because if Vincent's grandfather was a murderer, what did that make Vincent? And more importantly, what would he do to keep his family's secrets buried? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the distant sound of traffic from the street below. Jenny had the distinct feeling that she was standing at the edge of a precipice, about to jump into an abyss from which there would be no return. Vincent's phone buzzed, breaking the tension. He glanced at it and frowned. "I have to take this." "Wait here." He stepped into the adjoining room, but Jenny could still hear his muffled voice through the door. What she heard made her blood run cold. "Yes, I found her. The carpenter's daughter. She has Rose's locket and a photograph. No, she doesn't know anything yet, but she's asking questions. I understand. Handle it the same way you handled the father. Jenny's heart stopped. The same way you handled the father? Her father hadn't died of cancer. He'd been murdered. She grabbed the cigar box and fled from the room, her mind reeling with the horrible truth. Vincent Thornfield hadn't been helping her uncover his grandfather's crimes. He'd been continuing them. As she raced down the club's elegant staircase, Jenny realized that she wasn't just carrying her father's legacy. She was carrying the evidence that could destroy the Thornfield empire. And Vincent would kill her to keep it buried, just as his family had been killing people for 70 years. Behind her, she heard Vincent's voice calling her name, but she didn't stop running. She had to survive long enough to expose the truth. It was what her father would have wanted. It was what Rose Manning deserved. The game had changed. This wasn't about justice anymore. It was about survival. Jenny spent the next 3 days in hiding, staying in a cheap motel on the outskirts of the city and paying cash for everything. She'd turned off her phone, knowing that Vincent would have the resources to track her if she wasn't careful. But she hadn't been idle. She'd been researching, digging into newspaper archives and public records, trying to piece together the truth about Rose Manning's death. What she found painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond one suspicious accident. Rose Manning hadn't just been wealthy, she'd been a reformer, a young woman who'd inherited her father's construction business and had been working to expose unsafe practices and mob connections in the city's building industry. In the weeks before her death, she'd been scheduled to testify before a grand jury about bid rigging and bribery in city contracts. Her death had effectively ended the investigation. Without her testimony, the grand jury was disbanded, and the corrupt practices continued unchecked. The companies that benefited most from the shutdown were all connected to one man, Vincent's grandfather, George Thornfield. Jenny also discovered that her father hadn't just been a carpenter working on Rose's house. According to employment records she found in the city archives, he'd been Rose's foreman, her most trusted worker. More than that, he'd been her friend. The newspaper clipping Vincent had shown her was incomplete. Jenny found the full article, which revealed that Richard Coleman had told police he'd seen a black sedan following Rose's car on the night she died. He'd tried to warn her, but she dismissed his concerns as paranoia. The investigation notes, buried deep in the police archives, showed that Richard had given detectives the license plate number of the sedan. The car was registered to a company that was, after several layers of shell corporations, owned by George Thornfield. But the investigation had been closed before anyone could follow up on that lead. The detective in charge had suddenly retired and moved to Arizona. The evidence had disappeared from the police files, and Richard Coleman had been warned to keep quiet about what he'd seen. He'd kept that silence for 70 years, carrying the weight of Rose's murder until his death. But he'd kept the proof, the locket and the photograph, as insurance, or perhaps as a promise that someday justice would be served. Now it was up to Jenny to fulfill that promise. She was sitting in the motel room, surrounded by printouts and photocopied documents, when she heard the knock on the door. Her heart stopped. She'd been so careful. How had they found her?
Jenny!
The voice was female, older. My name is Dorothy Hayes. I was Rose Manning's sister. I think we need to talk. Jenny's mind raced. This could be a trap. Another member of the conspiracy coming to silence her. But something in the woman's voice, a quality of grief and exhaustion, made her believe it was genuine. She opened the door to find a woman in her 70s with silver hair and Rose's kind eyes. Dorothy Hayes looked like she had been carrying a burden for just as long as Jenny's father had. I saw the story in the newspaper, Dorothy said quietly, about Richard Coleman's death. I knew this day would come eventually. Jenny let her in, and Dorothy sat heavily in the room's single chair, looking around at the scattered documents. You've been busy, she observed. You've figured out most of it, haven't you? I know your sister was murdered, Jenny said. I know my father witnessed it, and I know the Thornfields have been covering it up for 70 years. Dorothy nodded sadly. Rose was going to change everything. She had evidence of the corruption, the connections between George Thornfield and organized crime. She was brave enough to stand up to them. What happened that night? Rose had arranged to meet with the lead prosecutor in secret. She was going to turn over documents that would have sent George Thornfield and half the city's political establishment to prison. Dorothy's voice broke slightly. She never made it to the meeting. The car accident was staged. George Thornfield had connections to some very dangerous people. Making a car accident look convincing wasn't difficult for them. Dorothy reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. After Rose died, I received this in the mail. It was posted the day before the accident. Jenny opened the envelope to find copies of financial documents, correspondence, and photographs that clearly showed the web of corruption Rose had been investigating. At the bottom of the pile was a letter in Rose's handwriting. If you're reading this, then they've succeeded in silencing me. But they can't silence the truth forever. Richard Coleman has the other half of the evidence. Find him. Make sure my death means something. Jenny looked up at Dorothy with tears in her eyes. She knew they were going to kill her. She knew the risks. But she thought if she could just get the evidence to the right people. Dorothy trailed off. Your father contacted me once, about 10 years after Rose's death. He said he had something that belonged to her, something she would have wanted me to have. But he was too scared to meet in person. He said they were still watching him. He kept the locket all these years. He kept faith with my sister, even when it cost him everything. Dorothy stood up. There's something else you need to know. Vincent Thornfield isn't just covering up his grandfather's crimes. He's been continuing them. Jenny's blood chilled. What do you mean? 3 other people have tried to investigate Rose's death over the years. A journalist in 1978, a private investigator in 1991, and a history professor in 2008. All 3 died in accidents within weeks of starting their research. The pattern was clear. The Thornfield family had been systematically eliminating anyone who got too close to the truth. And now Jenny was next on their list. We have to go to the police, Jenny said. Dorothy shook her head. Half the police department is in the Thornfield's pocket. We need federal authorities, people who can't be bought or intimidated. Do you know someone? I've been in contact with an FBI agent who specializes in cold cases. She's been trying to build a RICO case against the Thornfield organization for years. What we have might be enough to finally bring them down. Jenny looked at the evidence spread across the motel bed. 70 years of murder and corruption finally brought to light. Her father's sacrifice wouldn't be in vain. Rose Manning would finally have justice. But even as she felt a surge of hope, Jenny knew that Vincent Thornfield wouldn't go down without a fight. And the Thornfield family had never hesitated to kill to protect their secrets. The final confrontation was coming, and Jenny had no illusions about how dangerous it would be. The FBI field office in downtown Chicago buzzed with controlled energy as Special Agent Maria Santos spread the evidence across the conference room table. She was a compact woman in her 40s with intelligent brown eyes and the kind of focused intensity that came from years of hunting white-collar predators. This is extraordinary, she said, examining the financial documents from Rose's envelope. We've suspected the Thornfield organization's mob connections for years, but we've never had proof going back to the foundation of their empire. Jenny sat across from her, with Dorothy Hayes beside her. The older woman had barely spoken since they'd arrived, but her presence was a steadying force. This was what Rose would have wanted, her sister and her friend's daughter working together to expose the truth. The question is, Agent Santos continued, how do we build a case that will stick? Most of the original conspirators are dead. The evidence is 70 years old. We have the locket, Jenny said. We have the photographs and documents. And we have Vincent's confession that he was planning to have me killed, just like my father. Agent Santos looked up sharply. You recorded that conversation? Jenny shook her head regretfully. I was too shocked to think clearly, but Dorothy has been documenting the pattern of deaths for years. She has evidence that Vincent has been systematically eliminating anyone who got close to the truth. That gives us grounds for a warrant, Agent Santos said. We can search Vincent's properties, his communications. If he's been ordering hits, there will be a paper trail somewhere. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Agent Santos's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. It's the U.S. Attorney's Office. She answered the call, her expression growing increasingly grim as she listened. I understand, she said finally, and hung up. What is it? Dorothy asked. Vincent Thornfield has been found dead in his penthouse apartment. Apparent suicide. He left a note confessing to his grandfather's crimes and expressing remorse for continuing the family tradition of murder. Jenny felt the world tilt around her. That's convenient. Too convenient, Agent Santos agreed. Vincent Thornfield wasn't the type to kill himself. Someone got to him before we could. Who? Jenny asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. There are other members of the Thornfield family. Vincent had a cousin, Marcus, who's been running the day-to-day operations of the business empire. If Vincent was about to expose the family's secrets, the implication hung in the air. Marcus Thornfield had silenced his cousin to protect the family name, just as the Thornfields had been silencing people for 70 years. So what happens now? Dorothy asked. Do we just let them get away with it again? Agent Santos's eyes hardened. Not if I can help it. Vincent's death doesn't change the evidence you've brought us. We're going to bring down the entire organization, starting with Marcus Thornfield. She stood up, gathering the documents. But first, we need to make sure you're both safe. The Thornfields know you have this evidence, and they've already shown they're willing to kill to protect their secrets. As they left the FBI building under federal protection, Jenny couldn't help but think about her father and Rose Manning. Two good people who had tried to do the right thing and had paid for it with their lives. The Thornfield family had gotten away with murder for 70 years, but their reign of terror was finally coming to an end. The phoenix would rise from the ashes and justice would finally be served. 6 months later, Jenny stood on the courthouse steps as Marcus Thornfield was led away in handcuffs. The RICO case had been airtight. The evidence Rose had gathered, combined with modern forensic techniques and financial analysis, had exposed the entire criminal enterprise. The Thornfield empire was finished. Their assets were being seized, their properties sold, their victims finally receiving justice. Dorothy Hayes stood beside Jenny, tears streaming down her weathered face. Rose would be so proud, she whispered. She always believed the truth would come out eventually. Agent Santos approached them, a rare smile on her usually serious face. The judge approved the Victim Compensation Fund. The families of everyone the Thornfields killed or harmed will receive reparations from the seized assets. Jenny nodded, thinking of her father. The money wouldn't bring him back, but it would ensure that his sacrifice had meaning. There's something else, Agent Santos continued. We found Vincent's real suicide note hidden in a safe deposit box. He didn't kill himself out of guilt. He did it because he couldn't live with the knowledge of what his family had become. In the note, he asked that the truth be told, no matter the cost to the Thornfield name. Jenny felt a strange sense of closure. Vincent Thornfield had been a victim too in his way, trapped by a legacy of violence and corruption that he'd never chosen for himself. As she walked away from the courthouse, Jenny clutched the silver locket that had started it all. The rose design caught the afternoon sunlight, and the small emerald seemed to wink at her like a promise kept. Rose Manning's death had not been in vain. The truth had finally set them all free. This story reminds us that secrets have a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply they're buried or how powerful the people trying to hide them. One person's courage to speak up can bring down an empire built on lies and corruption. The truth may be delayed, but it cannot be denied forever. If this story of justice and the power of one person's determination moved you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who believes in the importance of fighting for what's right. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that prove truth always wins in the end. Click that notification bell so you never miss an upload that will restore your faith in justice. Thank you for listening.